My father looked me straight in the eye and said my daughter didn't belong in his will, after I had been paying for his life for almost 4 years. I didn't react right away, and that was the part that unsettled him the most, because in my family silence always meant agreement, compliance, another quiet surrender dressed up as respect, and for years that's exactly who I had been, the reliable one, the daughter who transferred money every Friday without fail, who made sure the electricity stayed on, the mortgage stayed current, the insurance never lapsed. The one who believed that if you showed up consistently enough, love would eventually meet you halfway. But standing in that kitchen, with my father leaning against the counter like he had just stated something obvious and my mother quietly rinsing a glass like none of this required correction, I realized something had shifted in a way that wasn't going back. Not this time. Not after what he said next. You have to understand, Tige, he added, calm, almost patient, like he was explaining something reasonable. We're thinking about what matters long term, and your situation, it's different. And I remember looking at him, really looking, trying to find any trace of hesitation, any sign that he understood what he was actually saying, but there was nothing there except certainty, and that's when I asked the only question that made sense in that moment. Different how, Dad? I kept my voice steady, polite, the way I had been raised to speak to him, the way I had always spoken even when I disagreed, because respect was never optional in that house, only selective, and he didn't even pause before answering. Your daughter isn't part of what we're building here, and I wish I could say I misunderstood him, that maybe he chose the wrong words, but I didn't, and he didn't. Because my mother didn't correct him, she didn't look shocked, she didn't even look uncomfortable. She just dried her hands and said, we don't want complications later, like my child, my daughter, was some kind of administrative issue, something inconvenient, something to be managed rather than loved, and that was the moment everything I had been doing for them started replaying in my head with a clarity I had avoided for years. Every transfer confirmation, every call where they needed a little help, every time I adjusted my own budget so theirs wouldn't fall apart, every birthday they missed, every excuse that somehow made sense at the time but felt hollow now, because suddenly the pattern was impossible to ignore. I wasn't supporting family. I was maintaining a system that had already decided my daughter didn't matter, and the worst part wasn't even what they said, it was how easily they said it, how normal it sounded coming from them, like this had been the understanding all along and I was the only one who hadn't caught up yet. So I nodded, just slightly, because I wasn't going to argue, not there, not like that, not while they still thought I was the same version of me who would absorb it and keep everything running anyway. And my father must have taken that nod as acceptance because his tone softened, almost satisfied. You're practical, Tige, you'll understand eventually, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because for the first time I did understand, just not in the way he expected. I understood exactly where I stood in that family, exactly what my role had been, and exactly what it was going to cost them to lose it, but I didn't say any of that, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't defend myself, and I didn't defend my daughter out loud either, because something in me had gone very quiet, very precise, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from defeat but from decision. And as I picked up my keys and walked toward the door, my mother finally spoke, like she had just remembered to maintain the illusion. You're not upset, are you? She asked, and I turned back just enough to answer her the same way I always had, calm, respectful, controlled. No, Mom, I said, I understand perfectly. And that was the moment everything changed, even if they didn't realize it yet. I had barely made it halfway down their driveway before my phone buzzed in my hand, the familiar notification tone that used to bring me a strange sense of responsibility now landing differently, heavier, almost insulting, because I already knew what it was before I even looked, a payment reminder I had set for myself years ago so I would never forget to take care of them, every Friday at exactly 9:15 in the morning, a quiet system I built into my life so their needs would never become emergencies. And I stood there for a second, staring at the screen, realizing how automatic it had all become, how I had trained myself to prioritize their stability over everything else without ever asking whether it was being earned or even appreciated, and for the first time I did not open the app right away, I just held the phone and let the moment sit, because now every number attached to that routine carried a different weight, not generosity, not family support, but proof of how long I had been financing people who could look at my child and decide she did not belong to them. And that realization did not come with anger the way most people expect. it came with clarity, the kind that removes every excuse you have been quietly protecting, and I remember unlocking my phone slowly, almost deliberately, not because I was hesitating but because I was taking control of something I had never questioned before, and as the banking app opened, the transaction history filled the screen, line after line, week after week, thousands of dollars moving out of my account into theirs, consistent, reliable, unquestioned, and I could hear my father's voice from earlier repeating in my head. Calm and certain, we are thinking about what matters, and that was when I realized he was right about one thing. This was about what mattered, just not in the way he believed, because what mattered to me was sitting at home waiting for me, a little girl who still thought her grandparents loved her, who had drawn pictures for them, who had asked me just last week if they would come visit soon, and I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself, not because I was overwhelmed but because I needed to be precise. This was not a reaction, this was a decision, and decisions like this do not get made emotionally if you want them to last. So I backed out of the transfer screen without sending anything, just like that, no dramatic gesture, no announcement, just a quiet break in a pattern that had never been broken before, and as simple as that action was, it felt like something far bigger had shifted, because for years my role in that family had been defined by consistency, by being the one who showed up no matter what, and now for the first time I was choosing not to, and I knew exactly how they would interpret that. Not as a boundary, not as a response, but as a problem to be corrected, because in their world my support was not optional, it was expected, and expectations have a way of revealing themselves when they are not met, and I slipped my phone into my bag and got into my car, the engine starting with a quiet hum that filled the silence I had left behind in that house, and I drove home without turning on the radio, without distracting myself, because I wanted to feel the full weight of what I had just done, not out of guilt, but out of respect for the moment, because cutting off something that had been constant for years is not small, even when it is necessary, and when I pulled into my driveway, I saw my daughter sitting on the front steps with a piece of chalk in her hand, carefully drawing something on the concrete, her face lighting up the second she saw me, and she stood up and ran toward the car, smiling in that way that makes everything else feel temporary, and as I stepped out, she looked up at me and said, "Mom, I made something for Grandma and Grandpa, do you think they will like it?" And I paused for just a fraction of a second, not because I did not know what to say, but because I understood exactly what was at stake now, not money, not control, but what she believed about the people in her life, and I knelt down slightly so I was at her level, keeping my voice gentle, steady, the way she deserved. "It is beautiful," I said, because it was, and she smiled wider, satisfied with that answer, not needing anything more, and as she turned back to her drawing, I stood there watching her, feeling something settle into place inside me, something firm and unshakable, because whatever came next, whatever calls or messages or pressure followed, it was no longer going to be about keeping peace or maintaining appearances, it was going to be about protecting her, and that was not something I was willing to negotiate anymore. The next morning started the way every Friday had started for years, except this time something was missing, and I could feel it before I even checked my phone, like a rhythm that had been broken without warning, and I went through my usual routine with my daughter, making breakfast, packing her bag, listening to her talk about a project she was excited to show her teacher, her voice light and hopeful in a way that made everything else feel sharper by contrast, and when I finally picked up my phone around mid-morning, there it was, the first message, not even a greeting, just a short text from my father that read, "Did you forget something?" And I stared at it for a second, not confused, just observing the wording, because even now there was no acknowledgement, no curiosity about me or my life, just an immediate assumption that whatever had not happened needed to be corrected, and I set the phone down without replying, not out of avoidance but because I was choosing the pace now. Something I had never done before, and it did not take long for the next message to arrive, this time from my mother, "Tige, the payment did not go through, can you check your bank?" And there it was again, calm, practical, as if this was a technical issue, not a decision, and I let a few minutes pass before I responded, keeping my tone exactly the same way I always had, respectful, measured, clear. "I did not send anything this week," I wrote, no explanation, no added emotion, just a fact, and the silence that followed lasted less than 2 minutes before my phone started ringing, my father's name flashing across the screen, and I answered on the third ring, not rushing, not hesitating, just steady. "Hello, Dad," I said, and his voice came through sharper than usual, controlled but strained in a way I had never heard directed at me before. "What do you mean you did not send anything?" And I could hear the shift already. The expectation meeting resistance for the first time, and I kept my voice calm, the same tone I used when explaining something simple. "I mean exactly that, I did not send a transfer this week." And there was a pause, not long, but enough to feel the recalibration happening on his end, and when he spoke again, the patience was gone, replaced by something closer to irritation. "Is there a problem we are not aware of?" And that question almost made me smile, not because it was humorous, but because of how carefully it avoided the real issue, as if the only possible explanation was a mistake, not a choice, and I answered him without raising my voice, "No, there is no problem with my account." And another pause followed, heavier this time, and I could hear my mother in the background asking something I could not quite make out, and then he lowered his voice slightly, the way he did when he wanted to regain control of a conversation. "Then fix it, Tige. We have bills scheduled this week." And that was the moment the pattern fully revealed itself, not just the expectation of support, but the assumption of authority over it, and I let a second pass before responding, not to provoke, but to be clear. "I am aware," I said, and my calmness seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have, because he exhaled sharply and said, "This is not the time to be difficult," and that word, difficult, landed exactly where it always had, the label used whenever I did not immediately comply, and I could feel the old version of me wanting to explain, to smooth it over, to avoid tension, but that version had already stepped aside the moment I walked out of their house the day before. So instead I said, evenly, "I am not being difficult, Dad, I am being intentional." And there was a silence on the line that felt different from the others, not confusion this time, but recognition. The kind that happens when someone realizes the situation is not going to resolve the way it always has, and his tone shifted again, this time sharper, more direct. "You cannot just decide to stop like this, we rely on that money." And I let that sentence sit for a moment, because it was the most honest thing he had said so far, not about family, not about support, but about reliance, and I answered him with the same clarity. "I understand that," I said, and I meant it. I understood exactly how much they depended on what I had been providing, which was precisely why I had stopped, and before he could respond, my mother's voice came through more clearly now, taking over the conversation the way she always did when emotions started rising. "Tige, sweetheart, if something is bothering you, we can talk about it, but this is not the way to handle things." And her tone was softer, more measured, but the message underneath was the same: redirect, minimize, restore the system. And I listened without interrupting, because for the first time I was not reacting to their words, I was observing them, seeing the structure behind every sentence. And when she finished, I replied quietly, "We did talk about it," and there was a brief pause before she asked, "What are you referring to?" And I did not need to raise my voice or repeat anything. I just said, "Yesterday," and the silence that followed was immediate and complete, because they both knew exactly what I meant, and in that silence, for the first time, the balance of the conversation shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because they were no longer speaking from certainty, and I was no longer answering from obligation. Neither of them spoke for a moment after I said that, and that silence told me more than anything they could have argued, because it was not confusion, it was calculation, the kind that happens when someone realizes the conversation has shifted out of their control and they are trying to decide which version of the truth will get them back into position. And my father was the first to try, his voice lower now, less confrontational, more measured. "That was taken out of context," he said, and I almost expected that, the quiet attempt to soften something that had been said very clearly, and I did not interrupt him. I let him continue, because I wanted to hear exactly how he would reshape it. "We were talking about long-term planning, Tige, not making emotional decisions," and there it was, the reframing, turning something personal into something practical, something reasonable, something that could be dismissed if I insisted on seeing it differently, and I answered him the same way I had answered everything else, without raising my voice, without adding emotion. "You said she does not belong," I said, and I kept it simple on purpose, because the simpler the truth, the harder it is to escape, and he exhaled, clearly frustrated now, but trying to hold on to control. "You are focusing on the wrong part of the conversation. and before I could respond, my mother stepped in again, her tone softer, almost concerned. "Tige, sweetheart, we did not mean it the way you are taking it. You know how these things get complicated, there are legal considerations, family structure, we have to think about fairness," and I listened carefully to every word, because for the first time I was not hearing what they intended, I was hearing what they revealed. And what she called fairness sounded a lot like exclusion. Dressed up in language that made it easier to defend, and I let a second pass before responding, not to argue, but to clarify. "Fairness does not exclude a child," I said, and there was a shift on the other end of the line, subtle but real, because now they were no longer explaining, they were being challenged in a way they were not used to, and my father's tone hardened slightly. "You are making this into something it is not," he said, and I could feel the familiar pattern trying to reassert itself, minimize, redirect, move past it, but I did not follow it this time. I stayed exactly where the truth was. "I am not making it into anything," I replied, "I am responding to what was said," and that sentence landed differently, because it left no space for interpretation, only accountability, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, and I could almost picture them looking at each other, deciding what approach to take next, and when my mother spoke again, her tone had shifted once more, less soft now, more pointed. "So this is what this is about," she said, and there was something sharper underneath it, something closer to accusation. "You are withholding support because you are upset," and I considered that carefully before answering, because the word upset was doing a lot of work in that sentence, reducing something structural into something emotional, something temporary, something that could be dismissed once feelings settled, and I answered her calmly. "No, Mom, I am not upset," I said, and I meant it. I was not upset in the way they understood it, I was clear, and clarity does not fade the way emotion does, and that seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because she paused before asking, "Then what are you doing?" And that question mattered, because for the first time they were not assuming, they were asking, and I answered it without hesitation. "I am adjusting what I support," I said, and I could hear my father shift on the other end, his patience wearing thinner now. "You cannot just change things without discussion," he said, and I almost responded immediately, but I chose my words carefully, because this was not about reacting, it was about defining something new. "I did not change anything without discussion," I said. "You made your position very clear yesterday, and that was the moment everything aligned, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, because they could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding." And the silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice could have been, and after a few seconds, my father spoke again, slower now, more deliberate. "You are overreacting," he said, and I let that word sit for a moment, not because it affected me, but because it confirmed exactly what I already understood, that in their framework, any boundary I set would always be too much, too strong, too inconvenient, and I answered him the same way I had answered everything else, steady, composed, certain. "No, Dad," I said quietly, "I am responding appropriately," and I could feel the shift settle fully into place then, because for the first time in my life, I was not negotiating my role in that family, I was defining it, and they did not know what to do with that yet. The line went quiet again after I said that, but this time it was different, heavier, like something had settled in a way they could not easily move around anymore, and I could hear my father breathe out slowly before he spoke again, his voice tighter now, less controlled. "So what exactly are you saying, Tige?" And I did not rush to answer, not because I did not know, but because I wanted the words to land exactly where they needed to, not louder, not softer, just clear. "I am saying that I will not continue supporting people who do not respect my daughter," and there it was, direct, simple, impossible to reinterpret, and the reaction was immediate, my mother's voice cutting in before he could respond, sharper than before. "That is completely unreasonable," she said, and I could hear the shift fully now, the patience gone, the mask slipping, because for the first time the situation was not bending back into their favor, and I stayed calm, the same tone, the same pace. "It is not unreasonable to expect basic respect," I replied, and she exhaled in frustration, the sound quick and dismissive. "You are turning this into something personal when it is not," and that sentence almost would have worked a week ago, maybe even yesterday, but now it felt hollow, like a script that had been used too many times to still hold weight, and I answered her without hesitation. "It became personal the moment you decided she does not matter," and that was the first time neither of them responded immediately, because there was no easy way to redirect that, no softer version that would erase what had already been said, and after a few seconds my father spoke again, but his tone had changed, less sharp, more strategic. "You are letting emotion interfere with responsibility," he said, and I recognized that angle instantly, the attempt to frame this as instability, as something temporary that would pass if they waited it out, and I shook my head slightly even though he could not see me. "No, Dad," I said quietly, "I am separating responsibility from obligation," and that sentence seemed to catch him off guard, because he did not respond right away, and I could almost feel him trying to reframe it again, to bring it back into something he could control, but there was nothing to adjust anymore, the structure had already shifted, and my mother stepped in again, her tone different now, less confrontational, more pressing. "We have relied on you for years, Tige," she said, and there it was, not hidden anymore, the expectation stated clearly, and I answered her just as directly. "I am aware," I said, and she continued quickly, as if trying to regain momentum, "Then you understand that stopping like this affects more than just you," and I let that sit for a moment, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to acknowledge the truth in it without surrendering to it. "I do understand that," I replied, "and I also understand that continuing would affect my daughter," and that was the point they had been avoiding, the part they kept trying to move around, and once it was said plainly, the conversation shifted again, and my father's voice came back, firmer now, almost impatient. "This is not about her," he said, and that sentence landed harder than anything else they had said so far, not because it was new, but because it confirmed everything, and I did not raise my voice, I did not argue, I just answered him with complete certainty. "It is entirely about her," and the silence that followed was immediate, and for a moment neither of them tried to correct me, because there was nothing left to reinterpret, and when my mother finally spoke again, her voice had lost its softness completely. "You are making a mistake," she said, and I could hear the warning in it, the shift from persuasion to pressure, but it did not have the same effect it once did, because I was no longer measuring my decisions against their approval, and I answered her calmly. "No, Mom," I said, "I am correcting one," and that was the moment everything settled into place fully, not as an argument, not as a conflict, but as a boundary that was not going to move, and I could feel it in the way neither of them responded right away, in the way the conversation had run out of the usual paths it followed, and after a few seconds my father spoke again, slower now, more deliberate. "We will talk about this later," he said, and I almost smiled at that, not out of defiance, but because it was the first time he had stepped back instead of pushing forward, and I answered him simply, "Of course," and when the call ended, I looked down at my phone for a moment, not expecting another message, not waiting for anything, just recognizing that something fundamental had changed, because for the first time in years, I was no longer responding to pressure, I was setting the terms, and they had heard me whether they wanted to accept it or not. The house felt quieter after that call, not because anything had physically changed, but because something internal had settled into a new shape that no longer depended on what came from the outside, and I moved through the rest of the day with a kind of steady awareness I had not felt before, not tense, not anxious, just precise, like every decision was finally aligned with something that made sense, and I did not reach for my phone again for several hours, not to check for messages, not to anticipate a response, because I already knew how the pattern would unfold. It always did, first confusion, then pressure, then silence while they recalibrated, and later, something else would come, something more urgent, more direct, but not yet, and I let that space exist without filling it, because for the first time I was not trying to manage their reactions, and when the afternoon light started to soften and my daughter sat at the kitchen table coloring quietly, I noticed how calm she seemed, how unaffected she was by something that had consumed so much of my attention for years, and that realization landed gently but firmly, because it reminded me exactly why this mattered, not in theory, not in principle, but in reality, in the everyday moments that shaped what she believed about herself and the people around her. And I made dinner, we talked about her day, she laughed about something her teacher said, and the normalcy of it all felt different now, not taken for granted, but protected, like something I was actively choosing to preserve instead of something that existed by default. And it was not until later that evening, after she had gone to bed and the house had settled into that quiet nighttime stillness, that my phone lit up again, this time with multiple Notifications at once, missed calls, messages, all arriving within minutes of each other, and I looked at the screen without picking it up right away, because I already understood what that shift meant. Something had moved on their end, something had gone from manageable to urgent, and when I finally unlocked the phone, the messages confirmed it, my father's name appearing again and again, short texts stacked one after another, call me, then we need to talk now, then this cannot wait, and underneath those, a longer message from my mother, more composed but carrying the same tension, Tige, we need to resolve this immediately, please answer your phone, and I read each one slowly, not rushing, not reacting, just observing the tone, the escalation, the difference between how they had spoken that morning and how they were speaking now, because urgency has a way of revealing dependency more clearly than any admission ever will, and I set the phone down for a moment, not ignoring it, but choosing the timing, because I was no longer responding out of obligation, I was responding out of intention, and when I finally called back, I did not wait long for him to answer. He picked up on the first ring, his voice tight, controlled, but carrying something underneath it that had not been there before. Tige, what is going on? He asked, and I could hear the strain now, not just frustration, but something closer to concern, and I answered calmly, I believe we already discussed that. And he exhaled sharply, the sound quick, almost impatient. No, we did not discuss this, he said, and there was a shift in his tone, something more direct now, less formal. The mortgage payment did not clear, and there it was, the first real consequence stated plainly, not abstract, not theoretical, but immediate, and I let that sit for a second before responding, not because I was surprised, but because I wanted him to hear his own words fully. I understand, I said, and he continued. Quickly, the urgency building, then you understand that this needs to be fixed tonight, and I could hear my mother in the background again, her voice quieter but insistent, reinforcing the same point. And I stayed exactly where I was, calm, steady, unmoved by the pressure that would have shifted me instantly before. No, I said, not sharply, not emotionally, just clearly, and the silence that followed was immediate, heavier than before, because this time it was not about interpretation or disagreement, it was about reality, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, but carrying something sharper beneath it. You are putting us in a very difficult position, he said, and I listened to that carefully, because for years that sentence would have redirected everything, would have triggered the instinct to fix, to smooth, to restore balance, but now it landed differently, not as a command, but as information, and I answered him with the same clarity I had held all day. I am aware of that, I said, and that was when everything shifted again, because for the first time, they were not dealing with a version of me that would absorb the impact of their situation, they were dealing with someone who understood it and chose not to carry it anymore. The quiet on the line did not last long this time, because urgency does not stay silent for long when something real is at risk, and I could hear it clearly in the way my father spoke next, his voice tighter than before, the control starting to crack under pressure. Then why are you not fixing it? He asked, and there was no attempt to soften it now. No careful wording, just direct expectation, and I did not rush my response, not because I needed time, but because I understood exactly what this moment was. This was the point where everything either returned to the old pattern or shifted permanently, and I answered him the same way I had answered everything else, steady, composed, certain, because I am not going to, I said, and the silence that followed was immediate and sharp, like something had just snapped cleanly in a way that could not be undone. And when he spoke again, the frustration was no longer hidden. You cannot just stop supporting your family, he said, and I listened to that word carefully, family, because it had been used for years to justify everything that had been asked of me. Everything that had been expected, everything that had been taken without question, and I responded calmly, I am not stopping support for my family, I said, and there was a brief pause before I added, I am redefining what that means. And that sentence landed harder than anything I had said so far, because it removed the assumption that they controlled the definition, and my mother's voice came through quickly after that, sharper now, more urgent. Tige, this is not the time for statements. We have real obligations, and I could hear the strain underneath her words, the shift from authority to need, and I did not interrupt her. I let her continue. The bank has already flagged the account. If this is not resolved tonight there will be penalties. And I acknowledged that quietly. I understand, I said, and my calmness seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because she exhaled and said, "Then act like you understand," and for a moment I almost responded immediately, but I stopped myself, not to hesitate, but to choose clarity over reaction, and when I spoke, my voice was just as steady as before. "I do understand," I said, "and that is exactly why I am not stepping in," and that was the moment everything shifted completely, because for the first time I was not just refusing, I was explaining the logic behind the refusal, and they had no framework for that, and my father's tone changed again, lower now, more deliberate, but carrying something heavier beneath it. "You are making a decision that affects more than just yourself," he said, and I let that sentence sit for a second before answering, because it was true, but it was not complete, and I responded quietly, "Yes, I am," I said, "and I am making it based on who you chose to exclude," and that brought the conversation back exactly where it needed to be, not on money, not on logistics, but on the reason everything had changed. And there was a pause, longer this time, because neither of them moved to correct it immediately, and when my mother spoke again, her voice was different, less sharp, more controlled. "You are connecting things that should not be connected," she said, and I almost expected that, the attempt to separate actions from consequences, to isolate the financial from the personal, and I answered her simply, "They are already connected," I said, "you made that clear," and that was when my father spoke again, his tone shifting into something I had not heard directed at me before, something closer to warning. "You need to think very carefully about what you are doing," he said, and I recognized that immediately, not as advice, but as pressure, the implication that there would be consequences for not returning to the expected role, and I did not react emotionally, I did not argue, I just answered him with the same calm certainty that had carried me through the entire conversation. I said, and then I added, just enough to close the loop completely, and I am comfortable with my decision, and that was the moment the dynamic fully reversed, not because I raised my voice or forced the outcome, but because I removed the one thing that had sustained their position for years, my willingness to absorb the consequences of their choices, and in the silence that followed, I could feel it clearly, they were no longer speaking from authority, they were responding from impact, and for the first time, I was not the one adjusting to keep everything stable, I was the one holding the line, and they did not know how to move around that yet. The silence after I said that did not break the way it usually did. There was no immediate correction, no quick shift back into control, just a pause that stretched longer than any we had had so far, and when my father finally spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I had never heard before, less certain, less structured. "Tige, this is serious," he said, and I could hear something underneath it now, not just frustration, but strain, the kind that comes when something real is starting to collapse, and I did not interrupt him, I let him continue, because for the first time I needed to hear where he would go without the assumption that I would fix it. "We cannot just let things fall behind like this," he added, and the word "cannot" stood out to me, not because of what it meant, but because of how different it sounded from everything that had come before, and I answered him calmly, "Then you will need to make adjustments," and there was a sharp exhale on the other end, followed by my mother's voice cutting in quickly. "That is not realistic," she said, and I could hear the tension clearly now, the shift from authority into resistance. "We have commitments, obligations, things that have already been set in motion," and I listened to that carefully, because for years I had been part of that system, the quiet mechanism that made all of those commitments possible, and I responded with the same clarity I had held all along. "So did I said, and that sentence landed differently, because it brought something back into focus that they had been avoiding, that I had not just been helping occasionally, I had been sustaining something continuous, something expected, something that had now stopped. And for a moment neither of them spoke again, and I could feel the weight of that realization settling in, not as an argument, but as a fact they could not move around. And then my father spoke again, his tone lower now, more controlled, but carrying a different kind of urgency. "If this continues, there are going to be consequences," he said, and I recognized that shift immediately, not just pressure, but escalation, the attempt to regain leverage by introducing risk, and I did not react emotionally. I did not argue, I simply answered him with the same steady tone, "I understand that," and my calmness seemed to push him further, because he responded quickly. "Do you?" he asked, And there was something sharper in that question, something closer to disbelief, and I let a second pass before answering, not to hesitate, but to be precise. Yes, I said, I understand exactly what happens when support is removed, and that sentence changed the direction of the conversation completely, because it reframed the situation in a way they could not ignore, not as a mistake, not as a misunderstanding, but as a direct consequence of something that had been taken for granted. And my mother spoke again, but her tone had shifted once more, softer now, but not the same softness as before. This one carried urgency instead of control. Tige, we are your parents, she said, and that line would have stopped me before, would have pulled me back into the role I had held for years, but now it landed differently, not as authority, but as context, and I answered her quietly, I know, and I meant it. I knew exactly who they were, and I knew exactly what that had meant for me. And for a moment she did not respond, and when she did, her voice was tighter, more strained. Then act like it, she said. And there it was again, the expectation wrapped in obligation, the belief that my role should override everything else, and I did not raise my voice, I did not challenge her directly, I simply responded with the truth that had been sitting underneath everything from the beginning. I am acting like a parent too, I said, and that was the moment everything shifted again, because that line drew a boundary they could not cross. It placed my responsibility beside theirs instead of beneath it, and the silence that followed was immediate and complete, and when my father spoke again, his voice had lost something, not volume, not control, but certainty. This is not how family works, he said, and I listened to that carefully, because it was not entirely wrong, it just depended on whose definition you were using, and I answered him calmly, this is exactly how it works when respect is not mutual. And that was the point where there was nothing left to negotiate, no angle left to adjust, no softer version to retreat into, and I could feel it clearly in the way neither of them responded right away, because for the first time, they were not dealing with resistance, they were dealing with finality, and after a few seconds my mother spoke again, her voice quieter now, more measured, but carrying something unfamiliar. What do you want us to do? She asked, and that question mattered more than anything they had said so far, because it was the first time they were not telling me what should happen, they were asking what could happen, and I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because I understood exactly what that shift meant, and when I finally spoke, my voice was steady, calm, and completely certain. Start by acknowledging what you said, I said, and the silence that followed felt different from all the others, not defensive, not resistant, but uncertain, because for the first time, the outcome was no longer in their control. The silence after I said that did not feel tense anymore, it felt final, like something had reached the point where it could not be softened or redirected, and for the first time since the conversation began, neither of them rushed to respond, because there was nothing left to reframe, nothing left to adjust without acknowledging what had actually been said, and when my father finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, not weaker, but stripped of the certainty he had relied on before. You are asking us to admit something we did not mean, he said, and I listened carefully to that, because it mattered, not just the words, but the distance he was trying to create between intention and impact, and I answered him calmly, I am asking you to acknowledge what you said and what it meant, and there was a pause after that, longer than any before, and I could hear my mother exhale softly, not in frustration this time, but in something closer to hesitation, and when she spoke, her voice was slower, more deliberate. We were thinking about structure, about planning, about what makes sense long term, she said, and I let her finish, because I had heard all of this before in different forms, and when she stopped, I replied gently but firmly, none of that requires dismissing a child, and the simplicity of that statement seemed to hold everything in place, because there was no argument that could move around it without revealing something deeper, and the quiet that followed was not defensive anymore, it was reflective, and for a moment I could almost feel them reconsidering something they had not questioned before, and then my father spoke again, slower now, more measured. We did not intend to make her feel excluded, he said, and I did not interrupt him, because intention mattered, but it was not the full picture, and when he finished, I responded just as carefully, but you did, I said, and there was no accusation in my voice, just clarity. And that difference mattered, because it left space for them to respond without escalating, and my mother spoke next, her tone softer than it had been all evening, we may not have handled that well, she said, and that was the first shift, small but real, not a full acknowledgement, not a complete correction, but movement in a direction that had not existed before, and I recognized it for what it was, not enough to restore anything, but enough to confirm that they were no longer speaking from denial, and I answered her quietly, it matters how you handle it moving forward, and that was where the conversation settled, not in resolution, not in agreement, but in a new understanding that had not been there before, and for a moment none of us spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said immediately, and then my father cleared his throat slightly, his voice steadier now but still carrying that underlying shift. We will need time to think about this, he said, and I nodded even though he could not see me, because that was fair. Time was something they had not given me when they made their decision, but it was something I was willing to allow now that the dynamic had changed, and I answered simply, take the time you need, and when the call ended, I did not feel relief the way I might have expected, I felt something steadier, something quieter, like a balance that had finally been restored in a way that did not depend on anyone else adjusting first, and I set my phone down and sat there for a moment, letting the silence of the house settle around me, not heavy, not tense, just still, and after a while I stood up and walked down the hallway to my daughter's room, pushing the door open just enough to see her sleeping peacefully, her small hand resting near her face, completely unaware of everything that had shifted that day, and I stood there for a moment, not thinking about the conversation, not replaying anything that had been said, just looking at her and understanding something in a way I had not fully allowed myself to before, that protecting her was not something I could negotiate, not something I could delay, not something I could balance against anyone else's expectations, and as I quietly closed the door and stepped back into the hallway, I realized that what had changed was not just the situation with my parents, it was the way I understood my place in all of it, because for years I had believed that keeping everything stable meant keeping everyone satisfied, and that belief had cost more than I had been willing to admit, but now the definition was different, clearer, stronger, and as I turned off the lights and let the house settle into the quiet of the night, one thought stayed with me, steady and certain, that family is not defined by who expects your support, but by who respects what you protect, and for the first time in a long time, I was completely at peace with where I stood.